Thank you, Robert. Appreciate it. David, rather. Welcome, everybody, to the Export Control Subcommittee meeting. I wanted to introduce myself. I'm with the University of Central Florida. And I also want to introduce Robert Gutierrez. He's from the Florida International University. So what I want to do, next slide, please. So what I wanted to talk about today, you can see the agenda. We're going to go over some of the subcommittee historical background of this, again, subcommittee. We're going to take a look at some of the current export control issues. I do want to talk a little bit about the faculty concerns and administrative burden that they face. And probably the most important part of this session today is to get feedback from membership about the future direction of this subcommittee. Next slide, please. So to start things off, just to give you the beginning, when we originally started this subcommittee, we have always been looked to identify a sponsor within the FDP that would support what it is that we want to do. And we were unable to identify that. And we did discuss with certain federal agencies if they'd like to participate, who are members of FDP, and it never worked out to our satisfaction. In any event, what we want to do is we want to move forward. So while we may not be able to identify a federal sponsor, I think that we can bring in as guest speakers, federal sponsors from those agencies to try to help and facilitate things that we would like to accomplish. So we're just going to move forward with that idea. And I hope that this session is the beginning of future ideas that will help us to move forward. Next slide, please. So some of the current export control issues that are out there that we're facing would involve high-risk entity lists, company screening, foreign talent programs. All of these are related to export control. The export classifications and jurisdiction determination, harmonizing federal regulations across agencies, export control regs, and also cybersecurity and CUI in the laboratory. And I'm sure there's a lot more. In fact, I've got about 15 other bullets that I'm going to bring up if we have time to talk about them. But these are some of the more important issues that are out there. And what, as I go through these slides, it won't take too long. I really want everyone to think about what direction that we may want to go. So next slide, please. So I also wanted to bring up some of the issues that we have with faculty concerns and some of the administrative burdens. At my university, part of the issues that we find is when we have controlled data and technology, and that is export controlled, we also have to control what's going on in the lab. And there's a lot of issues related to faculty having burden about controlling their data, interrupting their scientific experiments, not being able to use their students on the project, having to reconfigure their equipment to meet security standards. They thought that this was fundamental research, and in fact, they still have data security requirements. They still may have people requirements because of what the agencies are requiring. So, it really boils down to how is a faculty member supposed to conduct their research with these requirements. So next slide, please. So really what we want to do is we want to harmonize some of the requirements that are out there as an idea. We really want to think about best practices as another area where all of us can work together to come up with best practices that we think would be viable to other members of our community. We also want to think about ways in which we can reduce administrative burdens, which is also extremely important, not only for us, but for the faculty, and somehow affect positive change. So let's see. Next slide, please. Is that it? That's it. That's fine. Just leave it there. So one of the items I wanted to talk about to begin with is many people talk about the fundamental research exemption. And even when we have the fundamental research exemption, we find that in the contract, there's still requirements to curtail what people can work on it or who can work on it, what type of foreign nationals. We also run into the problem of data that needs to be controlled. And we have to get across to the agencies that should not be that way, negotiate out of the contract, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just one area where, to me, that would be a big area that we may want to contemplate and work together within the membership to figure out ways in which we can either work together to identify with federal agencies why this is happening, what we can do to curtail it. It's not really a new issue, but at the same time, it is something that never seems to go away. And I also can see that the agency restrictions on these that are delineated either in the FAR or other nomenclature in the contract that really at the end of the day it appears to be not as well known by the contract manager. They're just following requirements, especially when it comes to federal flow through on private industry. So, the key with all of this is to come up with an exchange of information to all the members. We really want to advocate regulations and policies to our federal agencies. And we really want to share policies and procedures. But really the key to all this is to find out what you think and what we'd like to do in terms of moving forward and what topics should this subcommittee consider is we really wanted to open it up to the membership and to talk about these issues. So I know there's 219 people on this Zoom call, but what we'd like to do is if anybody has comments, contributions, we'd like for you to raise your hand. And then Robert is going to allow you to speak. And I really would like to open up the floor to those people that are out there.
I'm going to unmute Melissa now.
Hi, Doug, Roberto, and everyone. So I wanted to put out there a different flavor of export control, compliance concern than just sort of controlled research or terms that might compromise a fundamental research exemption in the contract. It also, in order to comply with our export control obligations, we have an obligation to review international shipments of research materials to first classify the material and then, verify an end use statement, and then it's not going to an end user that might appear on one of the restricted party lists. And, that is of growing concern, in part because of some instances, I'm up in Boston, so some instances of, what appears to be theft of research materials leaving the country through Logan, packed in someone's socks, as well as just sort of the need in the pandemic to potentially be getting research materials to where a person is rather than potentially having them coming into the lab to perform their research. So I'm curious if other folks find that to be a growing area of concern for burden on researchers, and if there are any opportunities for FDB in that space.
I'm going to start since I know my mic's open, and I know we're a little unique in that the Florida state law on foreign influence is very burdensome, but shipments is a real issue because we have done some investigations on certain faculty because of talents programs and found that those shipments were being sent. And it's very difficult within our system to identify the contents of those shipments. It's not as difficult to identify when people are shipping, but to know that it's always after the fact, and we never know what the contents are. So I do agree with you that this is a difficult situation to uncover, to identify, and it would be nice to hear from other people as to see what they've done and how they may have resolved it.
So I'll add to that, Doug, that institutionally we had a similar issue like you're describing, and we actually have had to go through a process of the challenges. As most universities, these things are decentralized and people can ship stuff from their departments, and there's really not a centralized shipping department anymore these days in a lot of organizations. So the challenge is to educate your faculty and to go through a process by which, if you're shipping something internationally, that they have to check with an export control officer or a research office. So I agree that this is definitely a topic that we can definitely consider there.
Okay, I'm going to move forward with another topic. I guess I'm going to get a little bit more basic, Melissa, on the ideas that I have here. So I have a number of things here. I know that there's always difficulty in export classifications, the ECCN numbers, especially when it comes to dual use for both commercial and military. And I know that those are issues that are out there. And I would just be curious to know if anybody from an export classification point of view can share how they work that issue, how they work with the faculty to explain what needs to be done and why. And I would just open it up to everybody to see if they have any response to that topic.
Go ahead, Melissa.
You unmuted me and then I muted myself again and I realized we can't unmute ourselves. So I think, Doug, do you mean in terms of the outreach and the education or a process to classify? Because I will say that I do think on the administrator's side, and then potentially it trickles over to the actual researcher, actually classifying the item is of high burden, probably the highest burden part of our process, right? Asking for a simple lay end use statement, running the restricted party screen if you use a software like Visual Compliance are relatively simple, but digging down and actually determining the ECCN for the item that's being shipped can require a lot of back and forth with researchers. And, you know, a lot of times our researchers don't know why we're asking them all of these questions, or, you know, when it comes to biological materials, it can be really difficult because when we talk about like certain chemicals or reagents, people are like, I can give you the chemical structure. And I'm like, that's not really helpful. Like I need to try to like find the words on the list somewhere. And they're like, well, it hasn't been named yet because we don't know what it does yet. So how do you classify, how do you come up with an ECCN for a material that you're still trying to figure out what it does? So, you know, personally, I'd be interested in sort of if there are opportunities here for FDP to sort of look at crowdsourcing the wealth of intelligence across our members in terms of either, you know, better forms to elicit the information that we need to do that classification, or just like you said, Doug, if there's a better way to work with researchers to result in the correct ECCN quicker, because I think that that's what our researchers probably really want at my institution, at least, is, you know, how can I get to the end result I need, which is a correct classification so I can move forward with my shipment, but with you asking the fewest possible questions of me to get there. The back and forth is really where I think we lose our researchers.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And having a solution, I think, is everybody has their own way of doing it. So I'd be really interested in see what other people's thought. You know, this sort of ties into a certain degree to the technology control plans. and I hate to throw also the deemed export, but when you've got to get licenses and or you create a technology control plan, number one, you've got a number of, you have to design the plan, create it, put it out there for the faculty member and all of the people in the lab to review and see and agree. You've got to keep up with the people that are in the lab, because some people come and go, students, and they have to be updated and maintained. And so I would really be interested in knowing how people deliver the technology control plans, how they train faculty and all of the other research personnel that are at the lab to abide by the technology control plan. They maintain it, they keep up with it. I think that would be another helpful tool, whether we have a template or whether we just use best practices. I would just be open to hearing what other people say.
And Doug, we do have a comment in the chat from Elizabeth Peloso. Says, would anyone be willing to take on the risk of using another institution's classification? If they would, how would you engage with federal partners on something like this?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have an answer for that.
I don't know that I would be willing to take that risk here at our institution, right? So. And a follow-up comment is, AUCO is already doing a lot of work around sharing templates for TCPs and best practices.
Right. And that's a good point, because they're an excellent organization, and it is a way to perhaps we can team or work with them. And they do have a good process. So I guess I'll move to another topic that I have, which is screening. I'm interested to know how people go through their screening process. I know many people use databases to do that, but there's quite a bit of screening out there. Denied entities list, the unverified list, the entities list, the barred list. There's many lists out there. How do people use these lists? What systems do they use? What's the most efficient way to do it? Is there anybody that can share what they're doing that may help the rest of us?
I would venture that a lot of us are using visual compliance as a tool, right? So that's something that a lot of universities will have in common. And I think a lot of us have become familiar with the ASPE list, the Australian list, which is yet another screening tool I think some of us may be using. But I think that's something that, but there may be other examples out there. So I'd be curious to learn if any, what others are doing, right, to screen. So there's a comment coming in the chat that says, we have implemented a robot process to look up all faculty, staff, and students.
Really? How does that work? I'd like to know how that works.
And says to see if they're on the various lists. So how am I able? Okay, so let's unmute Joan. Let me see. So I guess, Joan, if you can raise your hand, I can unmute you. There we go. Okay, you should unmute yourself.
Hi, Joan Schenkel here. So we implemented robotic processing where I get a list of all of our faculty, staff, and students from human resources 4 times a year. And we run that list against everybody in SAM and, forgive me, EPA and one other database to see who is on both lists. And then we have we've now taken all the people that show up on both lists or show up as being identified, and we check to verify that they're not really debarred. Like John Smith, our John Smith is not the John Smith in Texas who's been debarred. And then the next time the robot runs the process, it already knows we've cleared John Smith. And we implemented that about 6 months ago. And we figure if we run it every 3 months, that gives us enough time to fix anything if there's errors. And Case Western Reserve University is starting to implement a lot of robot processing to take care of tasks like this. We still do some of the checks on individuals, but we feel like for the whole university, run this 4 times a year.
Wow, that sounds really robust. Is it an expensive adventure?
It was this micro, I can find out more about it. Somebody told me, I'm not a computer person, so I heard about this robot and I asked if it could do this process for me, and they said it could. It's actually part of our Microsoft suite, I think. Or it was something, it's not very expensive. It's not thousands and thousands of dollars at all. And we're trying to do robot processes for a lot of our financial reports, that these robots run these reports for people. It saves a lot of time, because if our institution wanted us to look up every single person by hand, and I said that's just we don't have the manpower to do that. So this was the compromise we came up with.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, because I know at my institution, we'll get contacted by the agency who said that they identified a PI's name in SAM, and they're reaching out to us to see if this person who is debarred is the same person identified as the PI in a proposal that they're ready to fund. And so everybody's moving quickly to resolve it and to get the information and on and on. So this would be a good solution to that. Wow.
And our justification for doing it 4 times a year was, if we did happen to miss somebody, we would have 90 days to make changes. So that's why we're doing it and our human resources gave us a list of all the faculty and staff.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. My email is, I'll put it in the chat, is JMS. So if anybody wants me to find out more and put you in touch with the right people to talk about how to make this robot work, I'd be happy to share.
Okay, appreciate that. When we talk about the lists and, for example, the ASP list, are there any institutions who are contemplating not doing business with those organizations on the ASP list, or on the unverified list, or any of those other lists? Has anybody gotten to that point?
I think, Doug, we do a case by case analysis each time, on the ASPE list, depending on what the project's about, right? So that's the approach that we take.
Okay. Well, another area that I had was on the Office of Foreign Asset Controls. And some of the checks and balances that we have on that process in order to approve transactions, processes, entities, et cetera, et cetera. Does anybody have any horror stories they want to bring up, or how they resolved an issue on any of the foreign asset control procedures? I'd also be interested to know on the technical assistance agreements, if there's anybody that has complications, difficulties, words of wisdom about technical assistance agreements and how they've been processed, and if they think that that's something that maybe the rest of the group would benefit from. Well, I think that one of the, the three main areas that I hope that this subcommittee could work on would be exchanging information to members, and that would include best practices. Perhaps take a look and advocate policies, regulations to the federal government, changes to those regulations, bringing in either guest representatives from Homeland Security, Department of Commerce, BIS. I would like to do that and get their feedback on it. And obviously share policies and procedures. And what I'd like to do is that if anybody's interested in participating in this process, meeting periodically between the FDP meetings, I would really enjoy your participation so that we can work together and continue this activity to make this a meaningful subcommittee. So if you are interested, I would really ask that you email either me or Robert, and you can email me at dbackman, BACKMAN, at ucf.edu. And Robert, I'll have you give them your email address.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat, but it's Gutierrez, Gutierrr, that's 3 R's at fiu.edu.
Melissa, do you have any final words or any comments?
No, well, sort of, I guess. Is that, there's export control kind of undercurrents in so many things, right? It plays a big part in some of the foreign influence working group discussions, and it has impacts in contracts, and kind of trying to figure out, how FDP can help in this space, because export controls does still appear high up there on the list in the faculty workload survey. And I expect, based on some of the events of the past few years, that it will factor as high or higher, in the next iteration of the faculty workload survey. And what can we do to help in that space? Because, when what's really, resonant to me from sort of the research compliance space is that, Sandy Schneider, when she was presenting, she was like, all right, well, how do you reduce your burden? How do you get your burden down as an investigator? And she said, well, for starters, you don't do human subjects research, you don't do IA Cook protocols, you don't do, all of these things that have compliance components. And in a lot of cases, in those things, you recognize that there's some amount of burden that's necessary and appropriate, right? If you're gonna do research with a human subject, you need to, you need to make sure you have an appropriate ethical protocol and plan in place. But I get really nervous if someone would start to say, looking at that survey, well, you don't do international research, right? And the export control regulations and compliance with the export control regulations in our pursuit of international research, they're important. They're real things that we have to make sure that we're complying with those laws. But where I get nervous is if it starts to seem to our researchers that like, oh, well, you know, that it's not worth it to deal with it, because of course, international research, international collaborations is just so important to all of our research enterprise. And so, you know, really interested to hear from anyone with ideas. So I'll pop my email address into the chat as well. So I'm the co-chair for Research Compliance Committee, which the Export Control Subcommittee is under. If there's anything that we can take on in this space. So like I said, you know, there's a lot of export control subcommittee participation in the FIWG, but maybe there's something that's not overtly in that space that we could take on to help reduce burden, or at least, you know, we may not be able to reduce the steps, but we may be able to make the steps clearer and, you know, improve the researcher experience as we're going through that, reduce the amount of back and forth. So just to reiterate what Doug said, you know, if anyone has ideas for projects that we could take on, or ways that FTP could be helpful in this space, we're all ears.
Yeah, I mean, I think the foreign influence is becoming just such of a big animal. And we at UCF, again, because of the state statutes, but even on the federal side, we are connecting it with conflict of interest, with the proposal process, obviously with our export control office, what work they've done in the past, who is being asked to come and work on the project, what visiting scientists are going to be there. You talked about shipments. I mean, everything that we've talked about is there. It's just really what's the best practice, what's the best way to do it, what are other people doing, how can we learn from each other, how can we reduce burden? That would be ideal. So I really welcome anybody's participation, and I look forward to hearing from you. And we're just going to keep moving forward the best we can with everything that we know that needs to be done.